The Vatican, a symbol of spiritual purity and divine authority, harbored secrets far darker than anyone could imagine. As a cardinal dean, my role was to serve the highest echelons of the Church. For decades, I obeyed without question, suppressing whispers of controversy and burying evidence that could tarnish the Church's holy image. Yet, the magnitude of what I discovered surpassed all heresies, all sins. This was not just about protecting the institution. It was about concealing the existence of things that should never have been. Every layer of the Vatican's bureaucracy held shadows that men like me were responsible for hiding. These weren't simply political or moral indiscretions. They were things that defied explanation, challenging the very nature of faith and divinity. I had seen the bureaucracy of the Church serve as a mechanism for covering these horrors, from lesser-known doctrinal conflicts to incidents involving the supernatural. These hidden truths, locked away in secret archives, had been known by only a select few throughout the centuries. My position granted me access to these forbidden places, and over time, I realized that the Vatican wasn't just protecting faith, it was protecting humanity from forces we were never meant to face. There were documents that spoke of unspeakable rituals, deals with entities that should not exist, and relics that pulsed with malevolent energy. These truths were sealed away, not for preservation, but for containment, to prevent these dark forces from ever resurfacing. As the years passed, I came to understand that the Vatican's greatest sin wasn't its earthly corruption or political maneuvering. It was its pact with these dark, forgotten forces. The Church had not just hidden its transgressions, it had embraced something far worse to maintain its power and influence. Every day I fought the growing doubt in my heart, questioning if the Church was truly a vessel of God or something far more sinister. The weight of these secrets began to take a toll on me. Every night I would wake in cold sweats, plagued by nightmares of the things I had read, the entities described in ancient texts. These beings, whose influence still seeped into the world, were not mere myth but very real, and I knew that my role was to ensure they remained buried. The Vatican was a fortress, not just against sin, but against the dark truths that could shatter the fragile faith of millions. Finally, I understood that the Church's facade of holiness was a thin veil, behind which lurked horrors beyond mortal comprehension. The Vatican was not just a sanctuary of God, but also a prison, housing powers that could undo the world. I had become a warden of these secrets, and I realized that if they were ever revealed, the very fabric of reality might unravel. My task was clear and unyielding, to find and destroy any document that threatened the sanctity and reputation of the Church. Over the years, I had burned countless papers, some detailing the misdeeds of clergy, others recounting incidents that could never see the light of day. Each time, I assured myself that I was acting in God's name, preserving the faith of the people. But deep down, I knew I was erasing history, concealing truths that deserved to be known. The Vatican's archives stretched deep beneath the Holy City, a labyrinth of forgotten knowledge. Many of these records contained not just heretical texts, but also evidence of darker, supernatural forces that had long been associated with the Church's history. It was not my place to question why such things were kept. My mission was simple: erase these dangerous truths before they could ever be exposed to the public. I became an expert at erasing the past, a silent custodian of the Church's dark underbelly. Finally, I understood that the Church's facade of holiness was a thin veil, behind which lurked horrors beyond mortal comprehension. The Vatican was not just a sanctuary of God, but also a prison, housing powers that could undo the world. I had become a warden of these secrets, and I realized that if they were ever revealed, the very fabric of reality might unravel. My task was clear and unyielding: to find and destroy any document that threatened the sanctity and reputation of the Church. Over the years, I had burned countless papers, some detailing the misdeeds of clergy, others recounting incidents that could never see the light of day. Each time I assured myself that I was acting in God's name, preserving the faith of the people. But deep down, I knew I was erasing history, concealing truths that deserved to be known. The Vatican's archives stretched deep beneath the Holy City, a labyrinth of forgotten knowledge. Many of these records contained not just heretical texts, but also evidence of darker, supernatural forces that had long been associated with the Church's history. It was not my place to question why such things were kept. My mission was simple: erase these dangerous truths before they could ever be exposed to the public. I became an expert at erasing the past, a silent custodian of the Church's dark underbelly. In time, the burden became unbearable. The act of burning the truth left scars on my conscience, and I began to feel that the Vatican wasn't just hiding these secrets for the good of the Church. It was hiding them because it was afraid. Afraid of what would happen if the truth about its origins, its deals with the dark, and its centuries of corruption ever came to light. As I rose through the ranks of the Church, my faith was initially unshakable. I believed I was serving God's will, even when tasked with protecting the Church's most damning secrets. Every prayer, every Mass, reinforced my conviction that the Church was a beacon of light in a world filled with darkness. But with each secret I was asked to keep, each document I destroyed, cracks began to form in my faith. At first the doubts were fleeting, dismissed as tests of my devotion. I told myself that the Church had always faced challenges, and that its survival depended on maintaining the trust of the faithful. But as I learned more about the hidden history of the Vatican, I began to see that these were not mere challenges. They were deliberate actions, and they weren't always in service of God. My loyalty to the Pope blinded me to the truth for far too long. Each new revelation made it harder to reconcile my faith with my actions. I prayed for guidance, seeking answers from God, but all I received in return was silence. My once clear connection with the divine began to feel distant, obscured by the weight of the knowledge I carried. The Vatican, the heart of Christendom, was beginning to feel like a fortress built not on faith, but on fear and secrecy. The faith that had once given my life meaning now felt hollow. How could I trust in an institution that had consorted with dark forces, that had buried its mistakes rather than atoned for them? My spiritual certainty crumbled, replaced by an ever-growing void. The rituals and prayers that had once brought comfort now felt like empty gestures, repeated out of habit rather than belief. With each day, the conflict inside me grew. On the one hand, I still felt a duty to serve the Church, to protect its image and its followers. But on the other, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was part of something deeply corrupt, something that had strayed far from God's light. The more I learned, the more I doubted, until eventually, I could no longer ignore the truth. My faith was being eaten away piece by the very institution I had sworn to uphold. Ultimately, I had to face the question that had been gnawing at me for years. Was my faith in God or in the Vatican? The two had once been inseparable in my mind, but now I saw that the Vatican was a flawed, fallible institution. It had strayed from the path, and in doing so, had led me astray as well. My faith in the Church was shattered, and all that remained was a deep, gnawing fear of what else might lie hidden in its shadows. It was a night like any other, or so I thought. In 1991, I was summoned by the Pope himself. His message was urgent, his tone unlike any I had heard before. It was not the calm, measured voice of a spiritual leader, but the strained whisper of a man burdened by a terrifying secret. He told me of a hidden library deep within the Vatican catacombs, a place few even knew existed. There were documents there, he said, that had to be destroyed immediately, no questions asked. As the Pope spoke, I felt a weight settle in my chest, as if the very air in the room had thickened with an unspeakable dread. His instructions were precise. I was to descend into the catacombs alone, locate the hidden chamber, and burn whatever I found there. The sense of urgency in his voice was unmistakable, and though I was no stranger to dangerous tasks, this one felt different. There was a palpable fear in the Pope's eyes, a fear that mirrored the unease growing inside me. Descending into the catacombs, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a tomb not just of the dead, but of forgotten horrors. The walls seemed to close in as the torchlight flickered against the cold stone. The air grew colder and heavier the deeper I went. I had been in the catacombs before, but this time was different. There was something oppressive about the silence, as though the very stones held the weight of centuries of hidden sin. After what felt like an eternity of wandering through those dark tunnels, I found the door the Pope had described. It was old and decayed, its wood splintering with age, but it bore the unmistakable seal of the Vatican. I hesitated for a moment, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread, as if something terrible lay beyond that threshold. But I had my orders, and as always, I obeyed. The door creaked open, revealing a small dust-covered chamber, and at its center, on a stone table, lay the documents I had come to destroy. As I approached the table, a strange sensation washed over me, a feeling that I was being watched, though I knew I was alone. The documents were ancient, their parchment yellowed with time, and yet they seemed to hum with a malevolent energy. A leather-bound journal caught my eye first, and beside it an old brittle scroll. I knew what I had to do: burn them without hesitation, as I had always done. But something stopped me that night, something deep within me that whispered that these documents were different. For the first time in my career, I defied a direct order from the Pope. Instead of destroying the documents on sight, I opened the journal and began to read. What I found inside would change everything. The words written there revealed horrors that I could never have imagined. These were not just records of church misdeeds or sins of the clergy. They were accounts of encounters with forces far older and far more dangerous than anything I had ever read about before. The diary was old, the pages fragile and yellowed with age, but the ink was still legible, the handwriting meticulous. It belonged to the Bishop of San Gimignano, a name I had only heard in passing, whispered in rumors. As I read, a growing sense of dread took hold of me. This was no ordinary journal. The bishop had documented his descent into madness, all under the guise of religious purification. His entries began innocuously enough, detailing his mission to rid his village of heresy, but soon they took a darker turn. The bishop described how he had appointed himself as judge, jury, and executioner. He would accuse anyone he deemed suspicious of heresy, often without any evidence. A sideways glance, a whispered conversation, or even a moment of hesitation during prayer could result in an accusation. The people of San Gimignano, terrified of the bishop's wrath, offered no resistance. They brought forth their neighbors, friends, and even family members to be judged by the bishop's cruel and unforgiving hand. The trials were little more than a performance, a charade meant to justify the bishop's sadistic actions. Once accused, there was no escape. The bishop took particular pleasure in detailing how he would torture the accused: burning hands, branding with hot irons, public executions, all in the name of purifying the soul. He described these acts not with regret, but with a sickening pride, as though he truly believed he was doing God's work. His writing was laced with a fanaticism that bordered on madness. As the entries progressed, the bishop's methods grew increasingly horrific. He wrote with sadistic glee about the decapitations he ordered, the bodies he left hanging in the town square as a reminder of his power. Heads impaled on spikes, left to rot under the sun, were a common sight in San Gimignano. The more I read, the more I realized that the bishop was not driven by faith, but by a thirst for power and control. He had become a tyrant, using the guise of religious righteousness to mask his bloodlust. But there was one story that stood out from the rest, a tale that made my blood run cold. It was the story of a man named Sako da Firenze, a villager who lived on the outskirts of the forest. Sako, according to the bishop, was no ordinary man. He was a healer, a practitioner of old, pagan rituals, and he was feared by the superstitious villagers. They believed he had made a pact with dark forces, that he spoke in tongues and performed strange rites under the full moon. Syriaco's knowledge of herbs and ancient practices made him an easy target for the bishop's insatiable desire to root out heresy. The bishop described how Syriaco was dragged before him, chained and beaten, his eyes burning with a defiance that unsettled even the bishop. From the very beginning, there was something different about Syriaco. The bishop noted that his presence seemed to warp the air around him, that the room felt colder when he was near. And when the tortures began, the true horror of Syriaco's nature was revealed. What should have been a routine execution turned into a nightmare beyond the bishop's comprehension. Syriaco's trial was unlike any the bishop had overseen before. Though he had presided over countless executions, none of his victims had ever behaved as Syriaco did. From the moment Syriaco was brought before him, something was amiss. His defiance, his calmness, even in the face of certain death, unnerved the bishop. Ciriaco was accused of witchcraft, of communing with dark forces, and though he was subjected to the same brutal interrogations as all the others, something about him was different. The bishop began with his usual methods. He ordered Ciriaco's fingernails to be ripped out one by one with red-hot pincers, a practice designed to break even the most resilient of souls. But Ciriaco did not scream, nor did he beg for mercy. He remained silent, staring at the bishop with those same unsettling eyes. And then, something extraordinary happened. The next day, when the bishop returned to continue the tortures, Ciriaco's fingernails had regrown, as if untouched. At first, the bishop believed it to be some kind of trick, an illusion conjured by the devil himself to test his faith. But each time he inflicted pain on Ciriaco, the wounds would heal within hours. Burns from hot irons vanished without a trace. Cuts mended themselves before the bishop's eyes. It was as if Ciriaco's body was immune to suffering, a living paradox that defied all natural laws. The more the bishop tortured him, the more his frustration and fear grew. Desperate to understand what he was dealing with, the bishop escalated his efforts. He ordered Ciriaco to be lashed, his skin flayed with whips until his back was a bloody mess. But by the next morning, Ciriaco's flesh had healed once again, smooth and unmarked. The bishop's entries in the diary became more erratic, his handwriting jagged and uneven as his mind unraveled. He was convinced that Ciriaco was not a man, but a demon in human form, sent to test his resolve. The bishop's fear soon turned into obsession. He could not understand how Ciriaco's body could regenerate so quickly, how no matter what he did, he could not break the man. Each attempt to purify Ciriaco only seemed to make him stronger, and the bishop became convinced that the only way to destroy him was through more extreme measures. He believed that if physical torture could not break Ciriaco, then something far darker, far more powerful, would be required. In his madness, the bishop decided to take Ciriaco to the underground chambers beneath the church, a place reserved for the most damned of souls. He believed that only in the depths, far from the eyes of God and man, could he finally rid the world of this abomination. But as he prepared to enact his final, most grotesque ritual, he realized that Ciriaco was not merely an ordinary man. Ciriaco was something far worse, something beyond even the bishop's darkest nightmares. As his frustration mounted, the bishop became convinced that the man he was trying to purify was no longer human, but something darker and far more dangerous. After each session of torture, Ciriaco's body would heal, as if untouched by the brutal punishment inflicted upon him. The bishop began to believe that he was not dealing with a man at all, but with a creature possessed by a force beyond his understanding. Determined to end Ciriaco's influence once and for all, the bishop decided to take him to a secret underground chamber, hidden beneath the church in San Gimignano. This chamber, built centuries earlier and forgotten by most, was reserved for the worst of the damned, a place where the most sinister rituals could be performed in isolation. The bishop believed that here, away from the eyes of the villagers and the church, he could finally rid the world of Ciriaco's unholy presence. As Ciriaco was dragged down the narrow stone steps, his chains clanking in the darkness, the bishop prepared for what he believed would be his final confrontation with the devil. The chamber itself was cold and damp, lit only by flickering torches that cast eerie shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and rot, and the oppressive silence weighed heavily on all who entered. Ciriaco was bound to the walls, his body limp but his eyes alert, watching the bishop with a cold, calculating gaze. It was under the light of the full moon that the bishop began his final ritual. The torches flickered as the bishop chanted ancient incantations, words that had been passed down through generations of clergy tasked with confronting the forces of evil. But as the ritual reached its climax, something began to change. Ciriaco's body, previously so resilient, began to convulse violently. His muscles tensed, his bones cracked and shifted beneath his skin, and his eyes, which had once held a human defiance, now burned with an animalistic rage. The transformation that followed was grotesque. Ciriaco's body twisted and contorted as his limbs elongated and his skin stretched, becoming covered in coarse, dark fur, His fingers grew into sharp, deadly claws, and his face elongated into a snarling maw filled with razor-sharp teeth. The bishop watched in horror as the man he had tortured for days became something far more terrifying, a creature that no ritual, no prayer could contain. Sako had become a monstrous hybrid of man and beast, a creature that defied all reason and understanding. His transformation complete, he let out a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the chamber, shaking the very foundation of the church above. The bishop, paralyzed by fear and awe, realized in that moment that he had failed. This was not a man possessed by the devil. This was something else entirely, something far older and far more dangerous. The bishop's faith, his resolve, shattered as he faced the true horror of what he had awakened. The creature that Sako had become could not be allowed to roam free. The bishop, consumed by fear, realized that his initial attempts at purification had been futile. This was no ordinary man who could be purged of his sins through fire and torture. This was something far more dangerous. Desperate to contain the horror he had unleashed, the bishop ordered his remaining followers to bind Sako in heavy iron chains, forged and blessed by the church to restrain the most vile of creatures. But the chains barely held the monstrous form of Sako as he writhed and growled, his eyes glowing with a predatory hunger. The bishop knew that simply chaining the creature would not be enough. Sako had proven that he could heal from any wound, regenerate from any injury. To prevent the beast from escaping and wreaking havoc on the world above, the bishop made the fateful decision to imprison Sako in the catacombs, deep within the bowels of the Vatican. The catacombs were a labyrinth of tunnels and crypts, filled with the remains of long-dead clergy and saints. It was a place where the light of day never reached, and where the Vatican had long hidden its darkest secrets. The bishop believed that by sealing Sako in the deepest part of these catacombs, he could prevent the creature from ever escaping and threatening the world above. He ordered a special chamber to be built, reinforced with blessed iron and consecrated by the highest-ranking members of the church. Sako was dragged to this chamber, his monstrous form barely restrained by the chains that held him. The walls of the chamber were covered in holy symbols, carved into the stone in the hopes that they would keep the creature at bay. The bishop, still consumed by his own fanaticism, believed that the power of God would be enough to contain the beast. But as he watched Sako being locked away, a seed of doubt took root in his mind. Could any prison, even one built within the heart of the Vatican, truly hold such a creature? As the iron door slammed shut, sealing Sako inside, the bishop prayed for forgiveness. He knew that what he had done was not enough. Sako was too powerful, too unnatural to be contained forever. But the bishop had no other choice. The creature could not be killed, so it had to be hidden, buried deep within the catacombs, where no one would ever find it. The church would keep its secret, as it had kept so many before. Years passed, and the memory of Sako faded from the minds of the living, but the chamber in the catacombs remained, sealed and forgotten. The bishop's diary was locked away, its horrific contents known only to a select few. Yet deep within the Vatican, far below the hallowed halls, Sako remained, a dormant nightmare, waiting for the day when his prison would no longer hold him. Before Sako was imprisoned in the Vatican's catacombs, he had to be transported there, a journey that proved to be as harrowing as any of the horrors that had come before. The bishop, having realized that the creature he had tortured could not be destroyed, devised a plan to move Sako to Rome, where the Vatican's ancient defenses would keep him contained. The journey would take days, and the bishop knew that it would be fraught with danger. The creature had to be transported in secret, without attracting the attention of the villagers or anyone who might question the church's actions. A special cage was built, reinforced with iron blessed by the church, its bars inscribed with holy symbols meant to keep the beast subdued. Sako, still bound in heavy chains, was placed inside, his body too weak to resist after days of torture. But the bishop knew that once night fell, especially under the full moon, the creature would regain its strength. The journey would need to be swift, and the bishop and his small group of followers would need to remain vigilant at all times. The first day of the journey was tense but uneventful. The cage was loaded onto a cart, and the group set off at dawn, traveling along narrow, secluded paths to avoid detection. Ciriaco remained silent for most of the day, his eyes closed as if in a deep, unnatural sleep. But as night approached, the air grew heavy with a sense of foreboding. The moon began to rise, and with it, the beast within Ciriaco stirred. The bishop watched in horror as the transformation began once again. Bones cracking, skin stretching, fur sprouting from his body. By the second night, the full moon shone brightly in the sky, and Ciriaco's monstrous form was fully revealed. His growls echoed through the dark woods, and the cart shook as he thrashed against his restraints. The holy symbols etched into the cage glowed faintly, but they did little to calm the creature. The bishop and his followers were forced to stop, unable to travel further with the creature in such a state. They camped in the woods, their only light coming from the flickering torches they held, while the creature raged inside its cage. Each night of the journey brought new terror. The beast grew stronger with every passing hour, its violent transformations becoming more frequent and more intense. By the third night, one of the followers, overcome by fear, abandoned the group, disappearing into the forest without a trace. The others were left to wonder if he had been taken by the creature or had simply fled in desperation. The bishop, however, remained steadfast. He knew that they had no choice but to press on, for if the creature was not delivered to the Vatican, all would be lost. Finally, after 5 days of travel, the group arrived at the Vatican under the cover of darkness. The journey had taken its toll on everyone involved, but the worst was yet to come. Ciriaco, still in his monstrous form, was hurriedly transported into the deepest part of the Vatican, where a specially prepared cell awaited him. The bishop, his face pale and drawn from the ordeal, watched as the iron door was sealed shut. The creature was contained, for now. Throughout the journey, Ciriaco's power over those around him began to grow. Though physically restrained by the iron bars of his cage and the holy symbols carved into them, the beast's influence extended far beyond its physical form. The bishop's followers, initially loyal and resolute, began to falter as the days went on. It started with whispers, soft, unsettling murmurs in the night, when the moon was high and the air was thick with tension. Ciriaco, even in his weakened state, seemed to possess a malign energy that seeped into the minds of those around him. At first, the followers dismissed the strange thoughts and feelings as mere fatigue, the result of sleepless nights and the strain of their mission. But as the days wore on, it became clear that something far more insidious was at play. They began to hear voices, soft, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder with each passing night. Ciriaco spoke to them, not with words, but with thoughts. He planted seeds of doubt in their minds, whispering of forbidden knowledge and untold power. He offered them visions of a world free from the constraints of the church, where they could be gods in their own right, wielding the same power that he possessed. The younger, more impressionable followers were the first to succumb to his influence. They began to question the bishop's orders, wondering if they were doing the right thing in keeping Ciriaco imprisoned. The bishop noticed the change in his followers, though he tried to deny it at first. They became restless, distracted, their once unwavering faith shaken by the presence of the beast. Some of them even began to approach the cage, drawn to Ciriaco despite their fear. They would stand before the bars, gazing into the creature's eyes, as if mesmerized by the dark power that emanated from within. Ciriaco's influence was subtle, but it was spreading, and the bishop knew that if he did not act soon, he would lose control. One night, as the group camped near the edge of a forest, Ciriaco spoke aloud for the first time since his capture. His voice was low and guttural, but there was an undeniable power behind it. "Why do you follow him?" Ciriaco asked, his words dripping with malice. "He is leading you to your death. I can offer you something far greater." The bishop's followers, already on the edge of rebellion, began to murmur amongst themselves, their loyalty to the church faltering. The bishop, realizing the danger, tried to reinforce his authority. He reminded his followers of their sacred duty, of the need to contain the evil that lay within Ciriaco, but his words rang hollow in the ears of those who had already fallen under the creature's spell. Ciriaco's malignant influence had taken root, and no amount of faith or prayer could undo the damage. The bishop's once loyal followers were slipping away from him, and he knew that it was only a matter of time before one of them made a fatal mistake. After days of battling Cyriaco's influence, the bishop finally succeeded in delivering the creature to the Vatican. The beast, still restrained in the specially prepared cage, was taken deep into the catacombs, far beneath the holy city where sunlight never reached. The Vatican's catacombs were a maze of forgotten tunnels, ancient tombs, and sealed-off chambers, and it was here that the bishop planned to imprison Cyriaco for eternity. Yet, even within these ancient walls, the presence of the creature was palpable. As the iron door of the chamber slammed shut, sealing Cyriaco inside, a profound silence descended upon the catacombs. For a moment, the bishop allowed himself to believe that the worst was over, that the beast was finally contained. But that night, as he lay in his chambers, the bishop was awoken by a sound he couldn't explain. It wasn't the distant echo of footsteps or the shifting of the stone walls, but a voice, low, guttural, and haunting. It came from deep within the catacombs, calling his name. At first, the bishop thought it was his mind playing tricks on him, the remnants of the terror he had endured during the journey. But as the nights passed, the voice grew louder, more insistent. It was Cyriaco. Somehow, even from within his prison, the creature was reaching out, speaking directly into the bishop's mind. The voice was filled with a mix of rage, mockery, and an unsettling calm, as if Cyriaco knew that his imprisonment was only temporary. "You cannot keep me here forever," Cyriaco's voice whispered. "I will be free, and when I am, no one will be safe." The bishop, his heart pounding, tried to pray, seeking solace in his faith, but the words felt hollow. The voice continued, growing more intimate, as though Cyriaco was standing right next to him. "You've seen what I am, but you haven't seen everything. There are things far worse than me, waiting in the dark." As the days turned into weeks, the bishop became consumed by Cyriaco's voice. Every night, the creature would speak to him, describing the horrors he had witnessed, the dark pacts he had made, and the ancient forces that had given him his cursed power. Cyriaco's words painted a picture of a world far darker and more twisted than the bishop had ever imagined, a world where the Vatican itself had become complicit in unspeakable acts. "We are not so different," Cyriaco would say. "You think you serve the light, but you've been walking in the shadows all along." The bishop's resolve began to crumble. His once unshakable faith was eroded by the constant barrage of Cyriaco's voice. He could no longer tell if the words were real or if they were the product of his own guilt and fear. The catacombs, once a place of silent reverence, had become a prison for the bishop as well, with Cyriaco's voice echoing in his mind at every turn. The bishop knew that if he didn't act soon, he would lose himself to the same darkness that had consumed Cyriaco. Despite the torment he endured from Cyriaco's voice, the bishop knew he had one final duty to fulfill. The diary and documents detailing Cyriaco's capture, transformation, and imprisonment were too dangerous to exist. If anyone ever discovered them, the world would know the truth about what lurked in the catacombs beneath the Vatican. The bishop, exhausted and frayed, made his way to the archive where the diary was kept, determined to erase the last traces of this horrific chapter. The room where the documents were stored was cold and dimly lit, the shelves filled with ancient tomes and scrolls that had not been touched in centuries. The bishop found the diary, its pages worn and stained from the years of neglect. He held it in his hands, feeling the weight of the knowledge contained within. Every detail of Cyriaco's capture, his tortures, and the nightmarish transformation that followed was written in these pages. And the bishop knew that it could never be allowed to fall into the wrong hands. With trembling hands, the bishop lit a small oil lamp and brought it close to the diary. The flame flickered as if reluctant to carry out the task, but the bishop steeled himself. He placed the diary on the floor and held the flame to its pages. At first, the fire hesitated, as if the very words on the paper were resisting their destruction, but soon the flames caught, and the ancient parchment began to burn. The smoke curled upwards, filling the room with the acrid scent of history being erased. As the flames consumed the diary, the bishop felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. The burden of the knowledge was being lifted, the secrets of Cyriaco's existence reduced to ash. But along with the relief came a deep, unsettling sadness. He wasn't just burning a record of evil, he was erasing a part of the truth, a truth that might have served as a warning for the future. The fire crackled as it devoured the last of the diary's pages, leaving behind nothing but charred remnants of a horror that the world would never know. But even as the flames died down, the bishop couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. Sako was still there, locked away in the catacombs, and the knowledge of his existence still weighed heavily on the bishop's mind. The documents may have been destroyed, but the threat remained. The Vatican had buried many secrets over the centuries, but this one felt different. This one felt alive, waiting for the right moment to resurface. The bishop turned and left the archive, leaving the ashes of the diary behind. He knew that his days were numbered. Sako's voice, though quieter now, still echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the darkness that lay beneath the Vatican. He had done what he could to contain the beast, but deep down, he knew that it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. And when that day came, the world would tremble.